What happens when a billionaire's arrogance meets someone who refuses to be bought? When revenge becomes love, and destruction turns into redemption? This is the story of Alexander Stone, a man who thought he could control everything and everyone, until he met the one woman who would bring him to his knees and teach him what it truly means to be human. By the end of this story, you'll witness the most shocking transformation you've ever seen. Trust me, you won't see the twist coming. Alexander Stone had everything money could buy. His Chicago penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, his garage housed 12 luxury cars, and his bank account had more zeros than most people could count. At 34, he was the CEO of Stone Enterprises, a real estate empire built on crushing smaller companies and absorbing their assets. Alexander lived by one rule: everything and everyone had a price. It was at his annual charity gala, ironic, considering he never donated from genuine compassion, that his life would change forever. The event was held at the Four Seasons, crystal chandeliers casting shadows over Chicago's elite. Alexander moved through the crowd like a king surveying his kingdom, his tailored Armani suit worth more than most people's annual salaries. "Alexander!" His longtime friend Marcus Rivera approached with a knowing smirk. Marcus owned a chain of luxury hotels and was one of the few people who dared challenge Alexander's ego. "Enjoying your own party?" Marcus asked, raising his champagne glass. "It's not about enjoyment," Alexander replied coldly. "It's about maintaining appearances. These people donate because they want to be seen with me." Marcus laughed. "Your arrogance never ceases to amaze me. You think you can control anyone, don't you?" "Because I can," Alexander said without hesitation. "Money, power, influence, they're all tools. People are predictable." That's when Marcus's expression shifted to something more dangerous. "Care to prove it?" Alexander's competitive nature flared. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus scanned the room and pointed toward the registration desk where volunteers were checking in guests. "See that woman over there? The one in the simple black dress?" Alexander followed his gaze to a woman who stood out not for her glamour, but for her complete indifference to the opulence around her. She had shoulder-length auburn hair, intelligent green eyes, and carried herself with quiet confidence. Unlike every other woman at the gala, she wasn't trying to catch anyone's attention. "Her name is Isabella Martinez," Marcus continued. "She's a social worker. Volunteers at events like this but never attends as a guest. Word is, she can't stand wealthy men like us." "And?" Alexander asked, already intrigued. "I bet you $50,000 you can't make her fall in love with you and marry you within 6 months." Alexander scoffed. "That's not even a challenge." "Oh, but there's more." Marcus grinned wickedly. "It has to be a real marriage. 6 months minimum. And Alexander, she has to genuinely love you, not your money. No bribes, no financial incentives. Pure charm and personality." The room seemed to quiet around them as Alexander considered the proposition. He'd never met a woman who didn't eventually succumb to his wealth and status. This Isabella Martinez would be no different. "Make it 100,000, Alexander said, extending his hand. "Deal," Marcus replied, shaking it firmly. "But when you lose, you also have to donate $1 million to her favorite charity." Alexander's smile was predatory. "When I win, you'll do the same to mine." Neither man knew they were setting in motion events that would destroy and rebuild a soul. Underscore 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 underscore. Alexander spent the next week researching Isabella Martinez. What he discovered intrigued him more than he expected. She was 29, had a master's degree in social work from Northwestern, and spent her days working with underprivileged families in Chicago's South Side. She volunteered at homeless shelters, organized community gardens, and had never owned anything worth more than $500. More interesting was what he didn't find: No social media presence seeking attention, no photographs at trendy restaurants, no apparent desire for fame or fortune. Isabella Martinez was, by all accounts, exactly what she appeared to be, genuine. This would make breaking her all the more satisfying. Alexander arranged their first meeting through a charity event she was organizing, a fundraiser for single mothers. He arrived at the community center in his most modest car, a Mercedes, his idea of slumming it, and had researched enough talking points about social causes to sound convincing. The community center was a far cry from his usual haunts. Faded linoleum floors, fluorescent lighting, and the smell of industrial coffee. Isabella was setting up folding chairs when he walked in, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a simple sweater. "Excuse me, are you Isabella Martinez?" he asked, turning on his most charming smile. She looked up, and Alexander felt an unexpected jolt. In the harsh lighting, without makeup or expensive clothes, she was naturally beautiful in a way that made the models he usually dated seem artificial. "That's me," she said, straightening up. "And you are?" "Alex." He lied smoothly, using the shortened version of his name. "I heard about your fundraiser and wanted to volunteer." Isabella studied him with those intelligent green eyes, and Alexander had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing right through his expensive casual wear to something deeper. "We can always use help," she said finally. "But I have to ask, why? You don't exactly look like you need community service hours." Alexander had prepared for this question. "I grew up poor," he said, which was technically true, though he omitted that he'd left that life behind at 18 and never looked back. "I want to give back." Something shifted in Isabella's expression, not quite trust, but a willingness to give him a chance. "All right, Alex," she said. "You can start by helping me move these tables." For the next 4 hours, Alexander Stone, a man who hadn't lifted anything heavier than a briefcase in years, moved furniture, served coffee, and listened to stories from people he'd normally never acknowledge existed. And Isabella, she was extraordinary. She knew every person's name, remembered their children's ages, their struggles, their victories. She moved through the room like light, bringing genuine warmth and hope to people society had forgotten. Alexander found himself watching her more than the people he was supposedly trying to impress. When the event ended, Isabella walked him to the parking lot. "Thank you for helping today, Alex," she said. "Will we see you again?" "Absolutely," Alexander replied, meaning it more than he expected. Would you like to get coffee sometime? I'd like to learn more about the work you do." Isabella hesitated, and Alexander realized he was holding his breath. "I don't date," she said finally. "It's not a date," Alexander said quickly. "Professional interest. I'm thinking of making some donations, and I want to make sure they go to the right places." This was true. He would donate to win the bet. "Okay," Isabella said after a long pause. "But somewhere public, and you pay for your own coffee." Alexander almost laughed. He'd spent more on wine at dinner than this woman probably made in a week, and she was worried about a $4 coffee. "Deal," he said. As he drove home in his Mercedes, Alexander felt a strange sensation he couldn't identify. For the first time in years, he was genuinely curious about another person. Isabella Martinez was going to be more challenging than he'd anticipated. Good. He enjoyed a challenge. What Alexander didn't know was that Isabella had recognized him immediately. She'd done her own research after Marcus Rivera had approached her the week before, offering her a deal she couldn't refuse: play along with Alexander Stone's seduction for 6 months, and he'd donate $2 million to the community center. The game was about to begin, but both players were hiding their true motivations. Over the next month, Alexander found himself in situations he never imagined. Coffee dates became volunteer sessions at soup kitchens. Expensive restaurant reservations were replaced by walks through Lincoln Park. Instead of impressing Isabella with his wealth, he was learning about her world, and discovering that everything he thought he knew about happiness was wrong. Isabella was a master of deflection. Every time Alexander tried to steer conversations toward personal topics, her background, her dreams, her vulnerabilities, she redirected to the people they were helping or the causes she supported. She was kind but distant, helpful but guarded. "Tell me about yourself," Alexander said one evening as they cleaned up after serving dinner at a homeless shelter. "I know about your work, but what about Isabella the person?" She paused in wiping down tables, her back to him. "What you see is what you get, Alex. I'm not very interesting." "I find that hard to believe," he said, moving closer. "Everyone has dreams, fears, things that keep them up at night." Isabella turned around, and for a moment, Alexander saw something raw in her eyes, pain, maybe, or loneliness. But it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Some dreams are better left buried," she said quietly. It was the first crack in her armor he'd seen, and Alexander filed it away for future use. But as he drove home that night, he found himself thinking less about exploiting her vulnerability, and more about understanding it. Meanwhile, Isabella was fighting her own battle. She'd agreed to Marcus Rivera's proposition for the money. The community center desperately needed funding, and $2 million could change hundreds of lives. She'd expected Alexander Stone to be everything she despised about wealthy men: arrogant, entitled, shallow. But Alex was different. He showed up when he said he would. He listened, actually listened, when people shared their stories. He'd spent his own money buying supplies for the shelter without being asked. Either he was the greatest actor she'd ever met, or there was more to him than his reputation suggested. The problem was, Isabella was starting to care about him. And that was dangerous for both of them. The turning point came 6 weeks into their acquaintance. Alexander had convinced Isabella to let him take her to dinner. "Just dinner, Isabella. Even social workers have to eat," and had chosen a modest Italian restaurant in Little Italy, nothing like his usual 5-star establishments. They were discussing the shelter's need for winter coats when Isabella's phone rang. She answered with growing alarm, and Alexander watched her face pale. "I have to go," she said, standing abruptly. "There's been an emergency at the center." "What happened?" Alexander asked, already reaching for his wallet. "Fire in the kitchen. No one was hurt, but the damage..." Isabella's voice broke slightly. "We'll have to shut down food services. That's 300 families who depend on us." Alexander didn't hesitate. "How much do you need for repairs?" Isabella stared at him. "Alex, you can't just..." "How much?" he repeated firmly. $50,000, she whispered. "But Alex, you don't understand." "Consider it done," Alexander said, pulling out his phone to call his bank. "Wire transfer tonight." "Why?" Isabella asked, tears threatening to spill. "Why would you do this?" Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something crack inside his chest. "Because you matter," he thought. "Because seeing you in pain is unbearable." "Because it's the right thing to do," he said instead. That night, as Alexander arranged the transfer, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't about the bed anymore. Somewhere between the soup kitchens and the coffee dates, between Isabella's genuine smiles and her quiet strength, he'd started falling for her. And he had no idea that she was falling for him too, even as she hated herself for it. The game had become something neither of them had planned for, real emotion in a web of lies. 2 months into their relationship, Alexander was living a double life that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. By day, he was, Alex, the reformed rich kid who volunteered at shelters and cared about social justice. By night, he returned to his penthouse and his ruthless business empire. But the two worlds were colliding in ways he hadn't anticipated. During a hostile takeover of a small construction company, Alexander found himself hesitating. The owner was a 60-year-old man with 3 employees, all supporting families. In the past, Alexander wouldn't have thought twice about crushing the competition. Now, he kept thinking about the families at Isabella's shelter, about the stories they'd shared of losing jobs and homes. "Sir?" His assistant, Jennifer, was waiting for his decision on the acquisition. "Cancel it," Alexander said finally. "Sir? Cancel the acquisition?" Find another project. Jennifer left, confused, and Alexander sat alone in his office, staring out at the Chicago skyline. Isabella was changing him in ways he didn't understand and wasn't sure he wanted. Meanwhile, Isabella was facing her own crisis of conscience. The money from Marcus Rivera's deal was helping hundreds of people, but every day she spent with Alex, every genuine smile, every moment of real connection, made her feel like she was betraying him. It came to a head during a quiet evening at the shelter. They were alone, cleaning up after the dinner service, when Alex started talking about his childhood. I grew up in a neighborhood a lot like this one, he said, stacking chairs. My father worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. I swore I'd never be poor again. Isabella stopped wiping tables. There was something in his voice she'd never heard before, vulnerability, real pain. What happened to your father? She asked softly. Alex was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He died when I was 18. Heart attack brought on by stress and overwork. I was angry for a long time. Angry at the world, at the system, at anyone who had what we couldn't afford. Is that why you became successful? Isabella asked. Alex looked at her, and she saw years of buried emotion in his eyes. I became successful because I never wanted to feel powerless again. But somewhere along the way, I think I became the kind of person I used to hate. Isabella's heart clenched. This wasn't the arrogant billionaire she'd researched. This was someone wounded and searching, someone who'd lost his way and was trying to find it again. People can change, Alex, she said gently. You're changing. Because of you, he said, moving closer. Isabella, I need to tell you something. Alex, don't, Isabella interrupted, backing away. Please don't. Don't what? Don't say something that will make this harder than it already is. Alex stared at her, confusion and hurt warring on his face. Make what harder? Isabella closed her eyes. She was falling in love with him, had already fallen, and every day made the deception worse. She was trapped between her feelings and her commitments, between the good she could do with Marcus's money and the man she was growing to care about. I can't do this, she whispered. Can't do what? Isabella, talk to me. But she was already gathering her things, fleeing from the shelter and from the conversation that would force her to choose between her mission and her heart. Alex followed her outside into the cold Chicago night. Isabella, wait! She turned, and he saw tears streaming down her face. Alex, you don't understand. Then help me understand. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. For a moment, Isabella almost told him everything. About Marcus, about the money, about the real reason she'd agreed to spend time with him. But then she thought about the families who would suffer if the funding disappeared, about the children who would go hungry, about the people depending on her. I can't, she said finally. I'm sorry, Alex. I can't. And she walked away, leaving Alexander standing alone on the street, feeling more lost than he had since his father's death. Either of them slept that night. Both were realizing that their fake relationship had become the most real thing in their lives, and that the lies they built it on might destroy them both. The next morning, Marcus Rivera called Alexander with news that would change everything. I have information about your little social worker, Marcus said. Information you're going to want to hear. Underscore 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 underscore. Alexander met Marcus at their private club in downtown Chicago, his stomach churning with dread. He barely slept, replaying his conversation with Isabella over and over, trying to understand why she'd run from him. Marcus was waiting in the leather wingback chairs near the fireplace, 2 glasses of scotch already poured. His expression was uncharacteristically serious. Sit down, Alexander, Marcus said. What I'm about to tell you is going to hurt. Just tell me, Alexander said, not touching his drink. Marcus pulled out a manila folder. Isabella Martinez. 29 years old. Social worker. Everything you know about her is true. He paused. But there's something else. 3 months ago, I approached her with a proposition. Alexander felt the world tilt. What kind of proposition? The same kind you and I made. I offered her $2 million to make you fall in love with her and marry her within 6 months. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. You're lying. I wish I were, Marcus said, sliding a document across the table. Signed contract. She agreed to everything, the relationship, the marriage, even consummation if necessary. Alexander stared at the papers without reading them. His mind was racing, pieces falling into place. Isabella's initial reluctance. Her careful boundaries. The way she'd deflected personal questions. Her flight the night before when things became too real. Why? Alexander asked, his voice barely a whisper. The same reason you took my bet, money. Her community center was facing bankruptcy. $2 million was too much to refuse. Alexander laughed bitterly. So she's just like everyone else after all. Is she? Marcus asked. Because from where I sit, it looks like she's falling for you as hard as you're falling for her. And that wasn't part of the plan. Alexander looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean she was supposed to be cold, calculating. Use you for your money and walk away. Instead, she's been volunteering extra hours, turning down opportunities to socialize with wealthy donors, and last night she called me. She called you? Marcus nodded. She wants out of the contract. She's willing to forfeit the money. Alexander felt hope flicker in his chest, then die just as quickly. Because she found out who I really am. No, Marcus said quietly. Because she's in love with you, and she can't stand lying to you anymore. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Alexander processed the revelation that Isabella had been deceiving him just as he'd been deceiving her. But unlike his cold calculation, her deception was destroying her. There's more, Marcus continued. I did some digging into her background. The reason she needed the money so badly, it wasn't just for the community center. He handed Alexander another file. This one contained medical records, financial documents, and newspaper clippings from 5 years earlier. Isabella was married before. Her husband, David Martinez, was a teacher. They were trying for years to have a baby, finally got pregnant through IVF. But during her 7th month, there was a car accident. Alexander felt his chest tighten as he read the police report. Drunk driver ran a red light. Marcus continued. David was killed instantly. Isabella survived, but she lost the baby. The medical bills from the accident and pregnancy complications, combined with funeral expenses, destroyed her financially. Alexander's hands shook as he turned the pages. Hospital records showing Isabella's extended stay in the ICU. Psychiatric evaluations for severe depression and PTSD. Bankruptcy filings from 2 years later. She's been working multiple jobs ever since, trying to pay off medical debt while running the community center, Marcus said. The $2 million wasn't just about helping others, Alexander. It was about survival. Alexander closed the file, feeling sick. Isabella hadn't accepted the deal out of greed, she'd accepted it out of desperation. A desperation he understood better than anyone. Why are you telling me this? Alexander asked. Marcus studied his friend's face. Because I've watched you these past few months. You're different. Better. And I think you love her, really love her, not just the idea of conquering her. It doesn't matter, Alexander said flatly. She lied to me. Like you lied to her? Alexander looked up, anger flashing in his eyes. But Marcus held his gaze steadily. You want to know the difference between you and Isabella? Marcus asked. She's destroying herself with guilt over deceiving you. You were planning to destroy her with the same deception. Tell me, Alexander, who's the better person? Alexander had no answer. He stood up abruptly, leaving his untouched drink on the table. Where are you going? Marcus asked. To end this, Alexander replied. All of it. But as he walked out of the club into the gray Chicago morning, Alexander realized he had no idea how to end a game where both players had already lost their hearts. Alexander drove aimlessly through Chicago for hours, his mind churning with everything Marcus had revealed. The woman he'd fallen in love with was as much a fraud as he was, but her deception came from desperation, while his came from arrogance and greed. As the sun set over Lake Michigan, he finally made his decision. He would confront Isabella, tell her everything, and let the truth destroy whatever was left between them. It would hurt, but at least it would be honest. He found her at the community center, alone in her small office, surrounded by paperwork and empty coffee cups. Through the glass window, he watched her for a moment. She looked exhausted, fragile in a way he'd never seen before. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual vibrant energy was nowhere to be seen. Alexander knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. Isabella looked up, startled. Alex! What are you doing here? We need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him. Something in his tone made her go very still. About what? Alexander sat down across from her desk, studying her face. About us. About the truth. Isabella's face went pale. Alex, I don't know what you... Marcus Rivera, Alexander said quietly. $2 million. 6 months. The color drained completely from Isabella's face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Isabella closed her eyes and nodded slowly. How long have you known? She asked, her voice barely audible. Since this morning. Isabella laughed bitterly. So you know everything. That I'm just another greedy woman willing to sell herself for money. Are you? Alexander asked. Isabella's eyes flew open. What? Are you just another greedy woman? Because from what I understand, you wanted to break the contract. You were willing to give up the money. Tears began to fall down Isabella's cheeks. It doesn't matter. I still lied to you. I still agreed to manipulate you in the first place. Yes, Alexander agreed. You did. Isabella flinched as if he'd struck her. But then again, Alexander continued, so did I. Isabella stared at him in confusion. What do you mean? Alexander took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, literally. My name isn't Alex, he began. It's Alexander Stone. I own Stone Enterprises, and I'm worth about $300 million. Isabella's mouth fell open. Marcus didn't just make a deal with you, Alexander continued. He made one with me too. I bet him that I could make you fall in love with me and marry me within 6 months. The prize was money I don't need and an ego boost I definitely didn't deserve. Isabella sat in stunned silence as Alexander laid out the entire truth, his real identity, his ruthless business practices, his original cold calculation in pursuing her. So you see, Alexander finished, we're both liars. The difference is, you were lying to help people. I was lying to win a game. Isabella's tears had stopped falling. Now she just looked at him with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. $300 million, she repeated slowly. Yes. And you've been pretending to be poor this whole time. Yes. While I've been agonizing over deceiving someone I thought was genuine and kind. Alexander winced. Isabella. Get out, she said quietly. Isabella, please. Get out, she screamed, standing up so fast her chair fell backward. Get out, get out, get out. Alexander had never heard her raise her voice before. The raw pain in her tone cut through him like a knife. Please, he said, standing but not moving toward the door. Let me explain. Explain what? Isabella demanded. That you're exactly the kind of man I thought you were? That everything I've started to feel for you is based on lies? Not everything, Alexander said desperately. Isabella, what I feel for you, that's real. More real than anything I've ever experienced. How would I know? Isabella asked, her voice breaking. How would I ever know what's real with you? Alexander had no answer for that. He stared at her, this woman who had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand, and realized that his deception had cost him everything that mattered. I love you, he said finally. That's real. That's the only thing in this entire mess that's completely real. Isabella looked at him with tears streaming down her face. Love built on lies isn't love at all, Alexander. It's just another transaction. The use of his real name from her lips felt like a funeral dirge. Isabella. Just go, she said, sinking into her chair. Please. Just go and let me try to figure out how to live with what I've done. Alexander wanted to fight, wanted to stay and make her understand. But the defeat in her posture, the exhaustion in her voice, told him that pushing now would only cause more pain. He walked to the door, then turned back. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you're the best person I've ever known. And I'm sorry, sorrier than you'll ever understand, for what I've done to us. Isabella didn't look up as he left. Outside, Alexander sat in his car in the community center parking lot, staring at the building where he'd learned what it meant to genuinely care about someone other than himself. He'd won the bet. Isabella had fallen in love with him. But the victory felt like the greatest loss of his life. Inside, Isabella buried her face in her hands and wept for the death of something that had never really been alive at all. The weeks following their confrontation were the darkest of Alexander's life. He threw himself back into work, but found no satisfaction in deals that would have once excited him. He moved through his penthouse like a ghost, haunted by memories of Isabella's laugh, her gentle hands helping strangers, her eyes lighting up when she talked about making a difference. Marcus called repeatedly, wanting to know the outcome of their bet, but Alexander ignored him. The game was over, and everyone had lost. It was during a particularly brutal board meeting, where Alexander was mechanically approving the acquisition of a small family restaurant chain, that he finally understood what he had to do. Sir? His assistant Jennifer said as the other board members filed out. There's something else. These restaurants we're buying, they're in the South Side. They employ a lot of people from the community center district. Alexander looked up sharply. What community center? Jennifer consulted her notes. The Martinez Community Center. Apparently, it's been struggling financially and may have to close. These restaurants were one of their few local job providers. Something clicked in Alexander's mind. He'd been thinking about redemption all wrong. It wasn't about winning Isabella back. The trust between them was too shattered for that. It was about becoming the kind of man who deserved her respect, even if he could never have her love. Cancel the acquisition, he said. Sir? Cancel it. And Jennifer, I want you to set up a meeting with our legal team. We're going to be making some changes. Over the next month, Alexander began the most important project of his life, not a business venture, but a complete transformation of who he was and how he used his wealth. He started with the Martinez Community Center. Through a network of shell companies and anonymous donations, he ensured they received enough funding to not just survive, but expand their services. New kitchen equipment appeared overnight. Heating bills were mysteriously paid in advance. A fleet of food trucks began showing up daily to serve free meals to anyone in need. But Alexander's redemption went deeper than money. He began visiting the families his business practices had destroyed over the years, not as Alexander Stone, CEO, but as Alex, a man seeking to make amends. He paid medical bills, offered jobs, funded education programs. He used his business connections to help small companies that had been hurt by his ruthless tactics. Most importantly, he changed how Stone Enterprises operated. No more hostile takeovers of family businesses. No more crushing competition just because he could. The company shifted focus to affordable housing development and community revitalization projects. His board thought he'd lost his mind. His profits dropped significantly. But for the first time in years, Alexander could sleep at night. He never tried to contact Isabella directly, but he heard about her through the network of community workers he was now quietly supporting. She was thriving, The community center's new resources had allowed her to expand programs for single mothers, job training for displaced workers, and childcare for families in need. She was also dating someone, a teacher named Michael who volunteered at the literacy program. Alexander's sources said they seemed happy together. The news should have destroyed him, but instead, he felt something unexpected, genuine happiness for her. Isabella deserved love that wasn't built on lies. She deserved someone as good and honest as she was. It was 6 months after their confrontation that Alexander finally saw her again. He was volunteering at a different shelter across town, anonymously, just Alex, again, when she walked in for some kind of interagency meeting. She was more beautiful than he remembered, her face radiant with the satisfaction of meaningful work and genuine relationships. She was laughing at something her companion, Michael, Alexander assumed, had said, and the sound cut through Alexander's heart like a blade. Then she saw him. For a moment, time stopped. Isabella's smile faded as recognition dawned. Alexander watched her process his presence, surprise, hurt, and something else he couldn't identify. Their eyes met across the crowded shelter. Alexander nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, then turned back to serving soup to the homeless man in front of him. He didn't try to approach her. Didn't try to talk. He'd learned that some forms of love meant letting go completely. But as Isabella left with Michael an hour later, she paused at Alexander's station. He looked up to find her studying his face, noting the changes 6 months had brought. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something quieter and more solid. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Alexander asked, genuinely confused. "For the center. The funding, the programs." "I know it was you." Alexander met her gaze steadily. "I don't know what you're talking about." Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given him since learning his true identity. "Of course you don't." She started to turn away, then stopped. Alexander," she corrected herself. "You're not the same person I met 8 months ago." "No," Alexander agreed quietly. "I'm not. Thanks to you. I didn't change you," Isabella said, shaking her head. "You changed yourself. Only because you showed me who I could be." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the bustle of the shelter but somehow isolated in their own bubble of shared history and loss. "Are you happy?" Alexander asked finally. Isabella glanced toward Michael, who was waiting by the door, then back to Alexander. "I'm trying to be. Are you?" Alexander considered the question seriously. Was he happy? Not in the way he'd once understood happiness, not through conquest or accumulation. But there was a peace in his life now, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with winning. "I'm becoming someone I can live with," he said. "That's a start." Isabella nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's everything." She reached out and briefly touched his hand, just a moment of contact, but it carried years of forgiveness and goodbye. "Take care of yourself, Alexander." "You too, Isabella." And then she was gone, walking back to her new life with the good man who deserved her love. Alexander finished his shift at the shelter, drove home to his penthouse, and for the first time in 8 months, felt something approaching peace. He'd lost the love of his life, but he'd found something more valuable: his soul. The bet with Marcus had been settled long ago. Alexander had technically won, Isabella had fallen in love with him. But the real victory was quieter and more profound. He'd learned that the only person worth becoming was the one Isabella had seen in him all along. Some stories don't end with the couple together. Some end with love transforming people into the best versions of themselves, even if they can't share a future. Alexander Stone had gained a fortune by being ruthless, and lost his humanity in the process. But through loving and losing Isabella Martinez, he bought back his soul. And in the end, that was the best bet he'd ever made. What do you think? Was Alexander's transformation genuine, or was it too little, too late? Could Isabella have made a different choice? Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that teach.